The slap before takeoff at the airport was buzzing with the usual noise of rolling luggage, crying toddlers, and announcements echoing through the air. But none of that mattered to Emma, who stood in the long line with her baby gently asleep against her shoulder, her arms tired, her back aching, and her thoughts scattered like loose papers in the wind. She hadn't slept well in 2 nights, and every muscle in her body begged for rest, but she kept holding on to her child, rocking him softly, trying to stay composed as her turn at the gate approached. Her hair was a mess, her jeans worn out, and her eyes showed all the signs of a mother who had given her everything to a newborn. Passengers moved slowly, and Emma looked around nervously, holding her boarding pass in one hand while keeping the other under her baby's back for support. When she finally reached the counter, a tall woman in a perfectly pressed uniform and a name tag that read Rachel raised one eyebrow and crossed her arms. Rachel had the air of someone who thought herself superior, someone who liked power and attention, and she looked Emma up and down as if she were nothing more than a problem on 2 feet. Rachel's voice was sharp and cold. Without emotion, she asked Emma in a tone that was closer to an accusation than a question if she knew she was standing in the wrong line. Emma blinked and said softly she thought this was the priority boarding line. Rachel didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, yanked the ticket from Emma's hand, looked at it briefly, and then laughed, a short, mean laugh that drew the attention of people nearby. "First class? Seriously," she said, without even trying to hide the mockery in her voice. "Do you even know what that means? Or did someone hand you this ticket by mistake?" By mistake. Emma's face turned red, but not from guilt. She looked down at her child, trying to shield herself from the humiliation pressing against her chest. She wanted to speak, to explain, to defend herself, but her voice didn't come out. She just stood there as Rachel shoved the ticket back into her hand and pointed to the end of the line, saying, "Next time, learn how to read a boarding pass, and wait your turn like everyone else." The people around Emma didn't say anything. Some looked away, others exchanged small smiles with Rachel, as if they were on her side, as if it was entertaining to watch a tired mother get dressed down at the gate. Emma turned slowly, walked to the side, and leaned against the wall, her baby still asleep and unaware of the storm swirling around his mother's heart. 50 minutes passed before the first-class boarding was announced again, and this time Emma stepped forward, carefully keeping her baby steady and her ticket ready. Rachel saw her coming and immediately stepped in front, blocking the way again, and said, "I thought I told you to wait until economy is called." Emma showed her ticket again and said quietly, "I am in first-class seat 2A. This time, Rachel didn't speak right away. She took the ticket again, looked at it, then looked at Emma with a scowl and said, "They'll let anyone in these days," and waved her through like she was swatting away an insect. Emma stepped onto the jet bridge, her hands trembling, her heart heavy, and her mind spinning with emotion. When she entered the aircraft cabin, the luxury of first class didn't soothe her at all. The seats were large, the lighting soft and calming, but none of it mattered because she still felt like she didn't belong. She sat down gently, settled her baby into her arms, and tried to breathe slowly, even though her chest was tight and her eyes burned with tears. She refused to let fall. A few moments later, Rachel entered the cabin and walked straight to Emma as if she'd been waiting for this moment, and without warning she reached down and pulled at the baby's blanket, startling Emma and causing the baby to stir. Rachel snapped at her, saying, "You can't just take up space like this. Do you think this is your living room? You need to hold the baby properly and not block the seat." Emma tried to explain, but before she could finish the sentence, Rachel's hand moved in a sudden sharp motion, striking Emma's arm hard and pushing it away. Emma gasped. The baby let out a small whimper, and the cabin went still as heads turned to see what had just happened. Emma sat, frozen, her lips parted, her eyes wide, and her breath caught in her throat. The sting on her arm was nothing compared to the shame and shock in her heart. Rachel didn't even seem to care. She straightened her uniform and said with no hint of apology, "If you can't handle a baby, maybe you shouldn't be flying at all." And then it happened. The cabin door opened again, and a man stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a custom suit and carrying nothing but a small briefcase. His face was calm and unreadable, but his eyes scanned the cabin quickly, and when they landed on Emma, his expression changed completely. He walked over to her seat, knelt beside her, touched her cheek gently, and whispered, "I'm here. I'm so sorry for being late. I came as fast as I could." Ma didn't speak. She only nodded, her lips trembling as a tear finally escaped and slid down her cheek. The man looked at the baby, smiled, and kissed the child's forehead before sitting in the seat next to them. Rachel, who had been watching from a few feet away, marched over, clearly irritated, and said, "Sir, you can't just take a seat without permission. You need to show your boarding pass or return to the back." But the man didn't respond. He calmly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small card, black with silver markings, and placed it silently in her hand. Rachel looked down, her face changing instantly. The color drained from her cheeks, and her lips parted in disbelief. She knew that card. She had seen it only once before, and it meant one thing: the man she just insulted, the man sitting beside the woman she had slapped, was not just a passenger. He was one of the owners of the airline, one of the top directors, one of the few people who could fire her with a single phone call. The silence between them was heavy. Rachel tried to speak, but no sound came out. The man finally looked at her, his voice low and steady, and asked, "Did you just put your hands on my wife?" Rachel stammered. "I didn't know she was. I thought she was." He interrupted her coldly. "That's the problem. You thought she was no one, so you treated her like trash. You think just because someone looks tired or wears simple clothes, they don't matter." Rachel tried to defend herself, but the man had already pulled out his phone and made a call. Within moments, the captain arrived, followed by a ground supervisor, and after a quiet exchange, Rachel was asked to leave the aircraft. Her protests fell on deaf ears. Passengers watched silently, some even smiling, as she grabbed her things and walked off, her head down and her pride shattered. Emma leaned into her husband, her body shaking slightly. He placed an arm around her and whispered, "It's over. You're safe now." She looked at him with a soft, tearful smile, and finally felt the weight lift from her chest. And in that moment, as the plane began to taxi and the baby slept peacefully between them, she knew that justice had been served. Not loudly, not with anger, but with quiet strength and dignity that spoke louder than anything else. Whispers in the sky. The plane rose into the sky, cutting through the clouds with quiet power. The mood in the first class cabin remained silent and uneasy. Emma sat quietly, her baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, and her husband sitting beside her, his face unreadable. As he stared out of the window while passengers around them tried to act normal, many of them were still shaken from what they had seen and heard. Just minutes ago, no one wanted to speak of it, but the tension floated through the cabin like thin smoke, invisible yet impossible to ignore. The air host walking down the aisle offered drinks with a polite smile, his hands trembling slightly as he reached their row. He handed them 2 glasses of water and bowed without a word before quickly moving on. Emma could feel the stares, the curiosity burning from the corners of people's eyes. Some passengers pretended to read magazines while stealing glances. Others whispered behind hands, pretending to talk about other things, but their focus kept returning to the couple in row, to the young mother and her child, and the man who had just fired a senior flight attendant with nothing more than a phone call. Ma shifted in her seat, holding her child tighter. She felt exposed, as if the entire flight had become a glass box with everyone watching. She hated attention, even when she deserved it, even when the wrong had been done to her. She never asked for eyes on her, never wanted people whispering about her name, but her husband placed his hand on hers and gave it a gentle squeeze, his voice low and warm like a blanket over cold skin, and he said, "You did nothing wrong. You held your dignity, and I am proud of you." Emma's eyes glistened with emotion. She looked at him, the man who had once stood beside powerful leaders in meetings and still knelt beside her like she was royalty, the man who had given up entire weekends just to rub her swollen feet during pregnancy, and now had stood up for her, not with shouting or rage, but with firm power and silent justice. She leaned into him, letting her head rest on his shoulder, her eyes finally closing for a moment of peace. Meanwhile, in the back of the plane, a quiet storm was brewing. The remaining cabin crew had gathered near the galley, whispering nervously. Rachel's sudden dismissal had sent ripples through the team. One of them, a junior steward named Kyle, spoke in hushed tones to the head attendant Michelle, saying, "I heard the woman's husband is not just a partner. He is the vice president of global operations." Michelle's eyes widened, her lips tightening as she realized the scale of what had just happened on their watch. They all knew what it meant, not just for Rachel, but for the entire team. The airline's leadership rarely flew commercially, but when they did, they watched everything, every detail, every reaction, every choice, and now they had just witnessed one of their own being disrespectful, abusive, and careless, not to an average customer, but to family of the executive board. It was worse than a mistake. It was a scandal that would follow them long after this plane landed in the cockpit. The captain received a discreet message through the flight system, confirming the identity of the man in seat to be the captain, who had once served 20 years with the airline, now felt sweat on his brow. Despite the cold air, he checked the route, double-checked the flight details, and ensured every member of his crew was on their best behavior. His voice calm as ever, but inside, he was nervous, knowing that one wrong move might cost him more than just reputation back. In the first-class cabin, a woman seated diagonally from Emma finally leaned over and spoke softly. "I just want to say, I saw what happened back there, and I'm so sorry for how you were treated. You didn't deserve any of that." Emma smiled politely, unsure how to respond. The woman continued, "My name is Lillian. I fly often, and I've seen Rachel before. She always acted like she was better than others. This time she went too far." Emma thanked her quietly, her voice gentle. As always, she wasn't the type to gossip or fuel fires, but inside she was grateful that someone had acknowledged what happened. Suddenly, a small cry came from the baby. Emma began rocking him gently, whispering a lullaby into his tiny ears. Her husband helped by covering the light from the overhead lamp and offering a soft cloth to keep the baby warm. Other passengers turned their heads, ready to complain, but when they saw it was Emma, they said nothing, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of guilt. No one dared speak a word, this time not after what they had seen. Time passed slowly, and Emma drifted into sleep, her baby quiet in her arms, and her husband reading through emails on his phone, not as a businessman, but as a father who had made sure his family was safe after what had nearly ruined their journey. He couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if he hadn't arrived on time, if his meeting had run long, if Rachel had been crueler, if someone had recorded the incident and shared it online. The thought made his chest tighten. He turned his phone off and looked at Emma and the baby, and promised himself he would never let anyone disrespect them again, ever, no matter where they were or how they looked. He had built this airline with a mission to serve with dignity and respect, and yet somehow a toxic attitude had slipped through the cracks and harmed the person he loved most. He wouldn't let it go unchecked. Meanwhile, far below in the airline's headquarters, a private alert had already been triggered, Rachel's employee file now marked with a formal violation and termination. HR had received a full report, along with a written statement from the executive himself detailing what had occurred, but more importantly, a second note had been included with specific instructions. Review the entire flight crew's behavior, review their customer interaction records, recheck complaints filed in the past 6 months. This was not going to end with just one firing. The message was clear. The airline's leadership had opened their eyes, and now every corner would be inspected, every complaint taken seriously, every action accountable. And though the plane was still high above the earth, the real turbulence had just begun. Emma finally awoke when the baby stirred. She looked around. The cabin still dim but calm. Her husband smiled at her, and she smiled back, her eyes tired but peaceful. The worst was behind her, and while the journey ahead might still be long, she knew she wasn't alone anymore. And perhaps the next time a woman with a baby walks toward the gate, someone might think twice before judging her by the tiredness on her face or the simplicity of her clothes, because now the sky had a witness: a quiet mother, a strong child, and a husband whose presence alone could bring justice. At 30,000 feet, eyes behind the curtain, the plane glided smoothly above the clouds, silent on the outside, yet heavy with whispers inside, while Emma remained calm, holding her baby gently. Her husband, Daniel, sat beside her as still as stone, but behind those quiet eyes, his mind was racing, not with anger but with purpose. His position at the top of the airline was not just a title, it was a responsibility, one he had sworn to uphold with fairness, dignity, and respect for every passenger on every flight. And now that vow had been tested in the most personal way possible. Back at headquarters, the internal investigation had already begun. The moment Daniel made the call from seat to be a digital chain reaction spread through the company system. HR, security, and operations were alerted quietly, without chaos or noise. The airline was built on precision, and this situation was being handled with the same silent force. Within hours, Rachel's file was flagged, her previous evaluations reopened, and old complaints resurfaced, ones that had been dismissed or buried without proper review. There had been warnings before, but they were overlooked by supervisors who never imagined it would come to this. Meanwhile, back on the plane, the first-class cabin remained polite on the surface, but cold underneath. Some passengers avoided eye contact with Emma, others watched her curiously. A few tried to smile, but it was forced and thin, like fog over glass. Emma felt the weight of being watched, not for being a problem, but for being the center of a silent storm she never asked for. But it followed her like a shadow, stretching from the gate to the seat beside her. Daniel could sense the pressure on her, so he did something unexpected. He stood up, walked down the aisle toward the galley, and requested a private word with the head flight attendant, Michelle. She looked nervous, her hands clutching the tray. She had just sat down, but she nodded and led him to the staff area behind the curtain. "Sir, I just want to say I'm truly sorry for what happened," Michelle said softly, her voice shaking a little. "It should never have happened to anyone, especially not someone like your wife or child." Daniel looked at her, his face serious but not unkind. He said, "Tell me something honest. Do the rest of the crew agree with what Rachel did, or did they just watch and stay silent because they were afraid?" Michelle hesitated, then said, "Most of them stayed quiet out of fear, sir. But Kyle, the youngest steward, he actually tried to stop her before boarding, and he got scolded for it." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the information like a judge weighing a verdict. He said, "I want Kyle's name and contact. I will speak to him personally also. I want a detailed report of Rachel's past behavior and how many complaints were received," and ignored. Michelle's eyes widened. She said, "I can get that for you, but sir, may I ask what happens after that?" Daniel looked her in the eyes and said, "What happens next is the difference between whether this airline becomes something to be feared or something to be trusted again." He turned and left the galley, returning to his seat beside Emma, who had not moved. Her eyes met his, and without a word, she knew something had shifted, not just for them, but for every mother, every passenger, every person who had ever been looked down upon for not looking the part. The flight eventually neared its destination. The cabin lights came on, and the captain's voice announced the descent. Passengers sat upright, collected their things, and prepared for landing. But behind all those simple motions, a storm was forming, one that would shake the airline from the inside out. After landing, Daniel and Emma were escorted through a private exit. No crowds, no noise, only the sound of their baby breathing softly against her chest. They were met by a sleek black car waiting just beyond the gate. A driver opened the door without a word, and as they stepped inside, Daniel received a message on his phone from his assistant. It read, "Sir, we found more. Rachel has been reported for verbal abuse on 3 previous flights, and physical contact was reported once by a young father traveling with his twin daughters last year." Daniel read the message in silence, his fingers slowly closing around the phone, his jaw tightening with every word. Emma looked at him worried, but he placed a hand on her knee and said quietly, "I'm going to fix this, not just for you, but for every person who ever walked on our planes and felt less than human." Back at headquarters, a special internal panel had been formed within hours. 5 department heads sat around a long table, reviewing footage, voice records, and passenger statements from the flight, and others related to Rachel's history. It became clear that a culture of silence had protected her. A pattern of favoritism, fear, and poor management had allowed behavior like hers to grow unchecked. The young steward, Kyle, was brought in for questioning, and he told them everything he had noticed. Rachel's attitude months ago: tried to report her once, but was told to focus on his duties. Instead of criticizing seniors, he had seen her belittle passengers, especially mothers, elderly travelers, and anyone who looked tired or confused. The panel took notes, but it was Daniel who made the final decision. Not as a husband, but as a leader, he issued a new policy that shocked the company. Every complaint would now be reviewed by an independent team. Passengers would be allowed to submit feedback directly to executives, and flight attendants would receive new empathy training with mandatory evaluations every quarter. The airline was going to change, not in slogans or ads, but in behavior and action. And Rachel, who had once walked the cabin like a queen, was now a name removed from all records, banned from working with any airline under the same partnership group. Her career grounded, not because of a single moment, but because she had forgotten that power without kindness is nothing. As for Emma, she never posted about the incident. She never told the world what had happened, never shared photos or videos. Even though others had offered, she didn't need to, because change had already started, and that was enough for her. She continued her journey through motherhood, one flight at a time, always holding her baby close, always remembering that even in the clouds, there is always someone watching, always someone willing to do what is right. And Daniel continued to fly, not just across countries but into meeting rooms across the world, spreading a message of first leadership, telling his story in silence, but making sure that no one ever forgot that one quiet mother with a sleeping baby had changed the future of an entire airline. The chain reaction 3 days after the flight that changed everything. Emma stood by the large window in her quiet home, watching the sunlight fall through the glass and onto the carpet, her baby resting against her chest, wrapped in a soft blanket, while the gentle rhythm of his breath calmed her heart. She still remembered the flight, not the turbulence or the meal or the soft music, but the way people looked at her, the way silence screamed louder than words, and the moment she realized how fragile dignity can feel in the wrong hands. Daniel had been working non-stop ever since, not as the executive in charge of operations, but as a man driven by something deeper than corporate success. He had attended 4 meetings in 2 days each. One focused on reform, policy change, and internal discipline. He had not told Emma everything, but she could see it in his eyes. The weight he carried now was personal. Inside the headquarters of the airline, a room had been dedicated to the reform task force. Every wall was covered in reports, charts, and employee profiles. The door stayed closed to the outside world. Only a few trusted people were allowed inside. People like Daniel, people like his advisor Karen, who had been with the company for over a decade and had always believed change was possible. Silperin stood by a digital board, scrolling through past complaints with a quiet fury in her expression. Each case told a story, a missed opportunity to protect a passenger, a family, a child. Every unchecked complaint was like a wound left open and untreated, and now they were bleeding from all sides. "We have been too blind too long," Karen said to Daniel as he walked in early that morning. "We thought efficiency meant discipline. We thought strict rules meant safety, but we forgot about humanity." Daniel nodded, his eyes scanning the new list of flight attendants. Under review there were 27 names on the list, each flagged for various behavior issues, some small, some serious, all ignored until now. He said quietly, "We cannot lead from above anymore. We must walk the aisle ourselves, see with our own eyes, speak to passengers, listen, without them knowing who we are. We need truth, not reports." Karen agreed, and by noon, a new internal audit had begun. Daniel himself booked 3 flights under false names, sitting in economy, dressed in simple clothes, carrying nothing more than a backpack. No guards, no attention, no first-class comfort. Just observation, just reality. On the first flight, he saw a young woman struggling to place her carry-on in the overhead bin. A male attendant passed by without offering help, but an older woman across the aisle stood up and assisted her. No crew member noticed. On the second flight, he watched a father with 2 kids get scolded for letting his son press the call button too many times. Instead of kindness, the crew responded with annoyance, as if children were an inconvenience. The third flight, he saw hope, a middle-aged steward named Marvin, who smiled at every guest, helped an old man walk to the restroom, and even offered his own jacket to a shivering teenager with no coat. Daniel wrote down that name and highlighted it in green, not for promotion but for protection. After those flights, Daniel returned to headquarters and spoke at a private board meeting, telling them, "We have to stop rewarding obedience and start rewarding kindness and leadership from the heart. We need people who see passengers as people, not problems." Back at home, Emma received a letter. It came in a white envelope with a golden seal. No return address, only her name on the front. She opened it slowly, curious, and inside was a handwritten note from a passenger on that same flight, a woman named Lillian, who had seen what happened and had been too shy to say more than a few words at the time. The letter read, "I want to thank you for how you handled that situation with such grace. Your silence said more than shouting ever could. I have traveled many times and never felt brave enough to speak when injustice happened around me, but watching you gave me the courage to write this, to promise myself that next time I will stand up, I will speak, I will not stay silent." Ma sat down, holding the letter close to her heart, not because it made her feel strong, but because it reminded her that small actions have long shadows, that kindness and quiet dignity echo farther than anyone expects. Meanwhile, far away in another part of the world, news of the incident had begun to spread, not through viral videos or public outrage, but through quiet industry channels, leadership blogs, private HR networks, and internal airline forums. The story of a mother in first class, the disrespect of a crew member, and the silent power of her husband who chose justice over publicity. It became a whispered legend, a quiet warning to those who wore uniforms and forgot their purpose. Other airlines began reviewing their training. Some updated their manuals, others added new modules, focused on empathy and emotional awareness. Pilots were briefed about in-flight culture, not just safety and schedules, but compassion and respect. The wave had started, and it was growing. Daniel received an invitation from a global aviation summit to speak, not as a businessman, but as a human being who had seen the cracks in the system and chosen to repair them from within. He accepted, but told them, "I will not speak about numbers, I will speak about people and the invisible weight they carry." When they step onto a plane as the summit date approached, Daniel continued his quiet flights, his secret observations, his late-night reviews of passenger feedback and staff behavior, not to punish, but to understand. He believed that the sky belonged to everyone, not just the wealthy, not just the polished, not just those who looked the part, and somewhere deep in the office where records are stored, Rachel's file remained untouched by her hand, but marked forever by the choice she made, a reminder that no uniform gives you the right to harm, that no title protects you from the truth, and that sometimes the smallest act, a slap, a glare, a word spoken without care, can cost you everything. And Emma still moved quietly through her days, raising her child with love, singing lullabies by the window, teaching him to smile before he could even walk, and holding close the lesson that even in silence you can change the world. Faces in the crowd. The morning sun painted the sky with orange streaks. As Emma stood in front of the mirror, her baby resting calmly in the crib behind her, the house was quiet, except for the soft hum of wind brushing against the windows. It had been almost a week since the flight that changed everything, but in her heart the moment still lived untouched, glowing in memory, not as pain but as transformation she had stepped onto that plane as a mother, tired, unnoticed, judged by a stranger, and she had walked off it as a symbol, though she never asked to be one. Her silence had spoken louder than voices, her calm had struck deeper than anger. Daniel entered the room, quietly carrying a small folder and a cup of warm tea for her. He handed it to her with a soft smile and said, "I need your help with something. Your eyes, your truth, not as my wife, but as someone who has felt the cold side of service." She took the folder, opened it, and saw a collection of stories, short statements from passengers who had experienced humiliation, neglect, or cruelty during their travels. She read each one carefully, slowly allowing the emotions to rise and fall inside her without rushing. A boy who had been mocked by a steward for stuttering during drink service, a blind woman whose guide dog was treated like cargo, an old couple who were ignored because they needed extra time to board. Each story felt like a scar carved into the quiet skin of travel, unnoticed until someone chose to look, and Emma was now looking deeply with eyes that understood, with a heart that still held the memory of her own wounds. "These are not just complaints," Daniel said softly. "They are signals, the lights we ignored, until one of them landed in seat 2A and reminded us who we are supposed to be." Emma looked at him and asked, "What do you want to do with them?" He replied, "I want to show them to the world, not for shame but for change. Let people see that behind every seat number is a soul, every aisle holds a story, and every uniform should mean protection, not pride." That afternoon, Emma and Daniel sat with a creative team, writers, designers, editors, and they built something simple and powerful, a digital space called Open Sky Stories, where passengers could submit their experiences anonymously or publicly, without filters, without fear, a place where real stories would breathe without being edited into soft apologies or corporate language. Within days, the platform was live, and the first 100 stories flooded in, not just from their airline, but from others. 2 stories from pilots, ground staff, and even former flight attendants who shared both regret and hope. It became a mosaic of truth, painful, beautiful, and long overdue. Back inside the airline walls, the ripple became a wave. Daniel held a company-wide meeting, not with cold reports or legal warnings, but with open conversation, live screens showing real messages from passengers, raw and honest, not just numbers but names and moments. He spoke about the power of kindness and how one single failure on one flight had opened the door for thousands of voices to rise. He did not fire people in that room. He did not threaten jobs. Instead, he offered choice: either continue the old way and slowly fade into irrelevance, or rise with truth and rebuild from the inside out, one flight at a time. The speech reached every employee from top to bottom. Even those who had never seen Daniel in person before began speaking of him not as a boss but as a leader who walked the same aisles, who carried his own bag, who cared enough to listen when others only met. A demo. The listeners was Marvin, the steward. Daniel had marked in green during his silent flights. Marvin was called in for a meeting, not in a cold boardroom but in the staff lounge. Daniel shook his hand and told him, "I saw what you did. I saw how you treated that old man, how you gave warmth when others offered silence. You remind me of what this airline was meant to be." Marvin smiled humbly, surprised by the recognition, and said, "I just try to treat people the way I would want my mother treated if she were flying alone." Daniel placed his hand on his shoulder and said, "Keep doing that and teach others too. We need more like you." Meanwhile, Emma was invited to a small forum organized by a non-profit that supported mothers who travel alone. She hesitated at first, unsure if she was ready to speak publicly, but when she stood in front of a quiet room, filled with women who had felt invisible, she found her voice. Not polished, not practiced, but real. She spoke about the flight, the slap, the silence, the shame and the quiet justice that followed. She told them, you don't need to scream to be strong, and sometimes dignity is your loudest answer. The audience listened with eyes wide and hearts open. Some cried, some nodded, some stood and hugged her. Afterward, thanking her for standing tall when it was easier to sit in silence, her story traveled further than she expected. It reached newspapers, blogs, social media, not because it was sensational, but because it was sincere, and that sincerity inspired others to share, to stand, to reshape how people see mothers, elders, children, and every soul who boards a plane with hope and lands with either peace or pain. As weeks passed, Daniel and Emma saw the effects everywhere. Flight attendants now received thank you notes from passengers for kind gestures. A stewardess knelt to tie an old man's shoe because he couldn't bend a gate. Agent waited 10 extra minutes for a late mother carrying twins. Small things, big impact. Change had begun, not with noise but with notice, not with fear but with faith. And in the corner of Daniel's office sat the same small card he had once shown to Rachel, the card that had ended a career and sparked a revolution. It reminded him daily that no matter how high you fly, you are always close to someone's pain, and every action matters, every word echoes, and every passenger deserves to be seen not as a seat number, but as a Chima continued her life with grace, raising her child with warmth and courage, not chasing fame, not seeking applause, just living truthfully and gently, holding the memory of a moment when the world judged her wrongly, and still she rose without shouting, without hate, only with love and quiet power. And above them the sky remained wide open, now a little kinder than before. The sky remembers 6 months had passed since the incident that changed the course of an airline and stirred hearts around the world. The weather was warm again, the trees alive with green, and the sound of birds filled the early mornings with soft music. Emma stood on the balcony of her home, with her child in her arms, no longer a newborn but a bright, giggling bundle of joy, who had learned to smile with his whole face. She watched the clouds drift slowly overhead, and felt something deep inside her shift, something peaceful, something strong like a tide that no longer feared the storm. Daniel came outside holding 2 mugs of tea. He placed one beside her, kissed her gently on the temple, and leaned on the railing beside her. Both of them watched the sky in silence, but it was not empty silence. It was full of meaning, full of memory, full of the quiet victory they had achieved together. Not for revenge, not for noise, not for attention, but for truth and change inside their home. The walls now held framed letters sent from passengers around the world, notes of gratitude from people who had felt seen for the first time, people who had been inspired to speak or act with more kindness, with more courage, with more understanding, all because a mother refused to respond with hate, all because a man chose compassion over corporate distance and dared to lead with heart. The airline had transformed in more ways than one. New training programs had been introduced, not just for staff but for management. Empathy classes, team building sessions, emotional awareness simulations. Pilots and flight attendants now worked closer than ever, not as ranks but as a family of professionals who remembered that their job was not just to transport, but to open sky stories. The platform created by Emma and Daniel had reached over 1 million views and had helped several airlines globally revise their service policies. It had also inspired new startup airlines to build from the ground up, with compassion at the core, and passengers now carried a voice that no longer felt ignored or buried. Their words mattered because someone had listened and responded with action, not apology. One day Emma received an invitation she had not expected. It was from an international travel and hospitality summit, asking her to speak not as a businesswoman, not as a celebrity, not as a victim, but as a passenger, as a mother, as a human being. Her first instinct was to say no, but Daniel encouraged her. He told her, "You were never just on a flight, you were the reason we all looked in the mirror and saw what we had become." She accepted, and the day of the event she walked onto the stage, wearing a simple dress, her baby in her arms, and her voice calm as she began to speak. She told them, "I am not here to complain, I am here to remind you that the person walking through your gate, tired with a crying baby, might be holding more than just luggage. They might be holding the last piece of hope they have, and how you treat them could either break them or build them. The room stayed silent through her speech, not a whisper, not a shuffle. Just the sound of her words filling the air like soft thunder, and when she finished, they stood and clapped, not politely but deeply, and some even cried because they saw in her their own mothers, their own wives, their own daughters, and they remembered that the sky does not belong to the proud, it belongs to the kind. Daniel watched from the audience, proud, not because she was his wife, but because she was the voice that gave meaning to his work, the compass that kept him steady in the storm of titles and power and promises. After the summit, the airline honored Emma quietly by naming one of their newest aircraft after her, not as a gesture of guilt, but as a tribute of gratitude. The name was not grand, it was not flashy, it was simply written in a graceful font across the side of the plane. The Emma Grace, soaring above the clouds, carrying the story of dignity and courage wherever it flew. Who boarded that aircraft often asked who she was, and flight attendants would smile and say, she is the reason we are better than we used to be. She is the reason we remember to look each person in the eye and say welcome, not just with words but with meaning. Rachel, whose name had once been feared among junior crew members, had not returned to aviation. She had quietly taken a different job far away from airports and uniforms, and every now and then she would see the name Emma Grace on the news or in an article and remember that one single moment of arrogance, one slap of the hand, had undone years of unchecked pride, and she would feel the weight of it, not out of bitterness but understanding, because time had taught her that kindness was never weakness and respect was never optional. Kyle, the young steward who had tried to speak up, was promoted. He now trained new hires, not with scripts but with stories. He told them about a woman who was humiliated and never raised her voice, and about a man who protected her not with rage but with truth, and how that couple reminded the world what it means to serve with heart. And so the airline flew on, its colors brighter than ever, its name whispered with respect, not for its size or its reach but for the warmth it carried. With every ticket, with every flight, with every smile, Emma returned to her peaceful life, raising her child with love and memory, her days filled with laughter and learning and soft steps across wooden floors. She did not chase more stages or spotlights, she did not write books or seek applause, she simply lived each day, knowing that she had made a difference in the sky and on the ground and in the hearts of many. And Daniel continued his quiet mission, not just leading an airline but building a legacy of humanity across miles, across borders, across time. His boardroom now had no long tables, no high walls, only open windows and open minds, ready to learn, ready to grow, ready to remember. And above them all, the sky stretched wide open, a little softer, a little warmer, a little more human. The sky had changed because one woman chose grace over anger, because one man chose justice over pride, because one baby slept through it all and woke up in a better world. And every time a plane took off from the runway into the endless blue, the story flew with it, invisible but unforgettable. Because some stories are not told in headlines, they are written in the hearts of people who choose love. When they are given reason to attend in the skies above us, they will always be remembered. The end.